The air in the arena was thick, almost stale. Not with boredom, but with the suffocating inevitability of the champion, Morgan. She stood in the center of the ring, bathed in a cold, blue light, the championship gold draped over her shoulder like a hunting trophy. She was reciting the names of her fallen challengers, her voice dripping with a casual, almost lazy contempt. The crowd booed, as they were expected to. It was all part of the performance. This was her arena. This was her show. This was her era. And everyone in the building, everyone watching at home, knew that no one was left. The division had been cleared out. The champion paused, smiling at a particularly loud jeer from the front row. "See?" she said, her voice echoing. "You have no one to believe in, no one to save you. I am the icon. I am the standard. And I am." The microphone clicked. A sharp electronic pop. Morgan tapped it, annoyed at the interruption. And then the blue lights evaporated, plunging the 20,000-seat arena into absolute, suffocating darkness. A collective gasp, a unified intake of breath, sucked the sound from the room. It wasn't a planned blackout. It wasn't part of Morgan's theatrics. This was something else. This was an intrusion. For 3 solid seconds, the only sound was the low hum of the broadcast truck, the silent panic in the champion's eyes, and the shuffle of thousands of feet as people rose, sensing the shift. Then, the sound hit. Not music. A single, resonant chime. A note that hadn't been heard in 4 years. A note that belonged to a ghost. The arena didn't scream. It froze. The sound of the chime hung in the air, vibrating in the chests of everyone watching. In the darkness, a silhouette appeared on the massive screen, just an outline. But the world knew that shape. They knew the stance. And then, the music hit. It wasn't a triumphant blast. It was a slow, agonizing, bluesy guitar riff. A song of redemption. A song of pain. The lights on the entrance ramp pulsed a deep blood red, cutting through the black. And there, standing at the top of the ramp, was Zara. She wasn't in her old gear. She was dressed in simple black, her hair shorter, her face etched with a severity that wasn't there before. The camera zoomed in, catching the focus in her eyes. She wasn't looking at the crowd. She wasn't playing to the camera. She was looking through them, her gaze fixed on the center of the ring. The crowd's freeze shattered. It broke into a sound that wasn't a cheer. It was a release. It was a desperate, primal roar of disbelief. People were grabbing their heads. Strangers were hugging. Phones were held aloft, shaking, as if trying to capture something impossible. In the ring, the champion, Morgan, stumbled back. Her arrogance evaporated, replaced by a pale, naked shock. This wasn't possible. The rumors were that Zara was done, that the injury was too severe, that the bridge was burned. Zara took her first step. The walk was slow, deliberate. Every step was a message. The announcers were silent. There were no words. There was only the sound of the crowd, the sound of the music, and the sight of a ghost walking back into the land of the living. The moment Zara's boot touched the bottom of the ramp, the internet fractured. It wasn't just the wrestling world. It was everything. Within 60 seconds, her name was the #1 trending topic worldwide, eclipsing global news and blockbuster movie releases. The clip, that 10-second pan from the ramp to the champion's horrified face, was already ripped, compressed, and re-uploaded thousands of times. It was on sports networks. It was being analyzed on mainstream morning shows by presenters who didn't know the difference between a headlock and a headline, but they knew a viral moment. They knew the sight of a queen returning to her usurped throne. Analysts and legends who had been dormant for years suddenly reactivated their accounts. "I have goosebumps," one Hall of Famer wrote. "The game has just changed." Another, a bitter rival from her past, posted just 2 words. "Oh, damn." The speculation machine went into overdrive. Was she medically cleared? Was this a one-night appearance? Was she signed? Who approved this? The silence from the company itself was deafening, a deliberate strategy. They let the fire burn. Fans weren't just happy, they felt validated. For 4 years, they had kept her memory alive in forums and comment sections, treating her retirement as a conspiracy, a great injustice. And now their faith was rewarded. This wasn't just a return, it was an "I told you so," shouted at the top of their lungs. They replayed the entrance again and again, dissecting the look in her eyes, the way she didn't smile, the chilling focus. They knew this wasn't a nostalgia run. This was a reckoning. If the arena was chaos, the backstage area was a vacuum. When the chime hit, every conversation in the locker room stopped mid-sentence. Wrestlers, producers, and crew abandoned their monitors, crowding into the narrow hallway to get a glimpse of the gorilla position, the staging area right behind the curtain. The reactions were split down the middle, a perfect snapshot of a divided generation. The veterans, the ones who had shared buses with Zara, who had bled with her, who knew the price she paid, looked on with a mix of awe and dread. They knew her intensity. They knew the standard she demanded, a standard many of them had grown comfortable ignoring in her absence. One of them, a former champion himself, just leaned against a road case, crossed his arms, and let out a low whistle. "Well," he muttered to no one in particular. "Fun times over. The new generation, the ones who came up after her, who built their careers in the shadow of her legend, watched with a different kind of fear. They saw a ghost. Zara was a measuring stick they had never had to stand next to. Now, the legend was flesh, and she was walking right past them. And then there was Morgan. After the show went off the air, a show that ended with Zara simply standing in the ring, staring her down as Morgan scrambled to escape, the champion stormed through the curtain. She didn't yell. She didn't throw things. It was worse. She was silent, her face white with rage, tears of humiliation burning in her eyes. She walked straight past the executives, ignoring their attempts to speak to her, slammed her locker room door, and the entire hallway was left in the terrifying quiet of her fury. The next morning, the sun rose, as it always does. But for Zara, the world felt tilted. She was in a sterile hotel room, the television off. The adrenaline from the night before had faded, leaving behind the dull, familiar ache in her surgically repaired shoulder. She rolled it, wincing. The crowd's roar was gone. Now there was just the silence, and the echo of the question she'd been asking herself for a year. Can I still do this? It was one thing to train in private. It was one thing to push her body in the familiar, controlled environment of her personal facility, miles away from the spotlight. It was another thing entirely to stand under those lights, to feel the weight of 20,000 people projecting their hopes, their dreams, and their demands onto her. They didn't see the woman who spent 6 months learning to lift her arm above her head again. They didn't see the scar tissue or the chronic inflammation. They saw the icon. They saw the savior. They saw the unstoppable force they remembered. She looked at her phone. It was unusable. Hundreds of text messages, missed calls from numbers she hadn't heard from in years, her family, her old friends, her agent. The expectation was a physical pressure, heavier than any championship belt. She had walked back into the arena, but the truth was she hadn't survived the injury yet. Not really. The physical part was healed, mostly. But the idea of the injury, the memory of the snap and the white-hot pain, the fear of that one wrong move, that was still there. The crowd wanted the legend. She was just a woman trying to prove to herself that the legend wasn't a lie. By midday, the company had called an emergency press conference. It wasn't a request. Zara sat at a long table, flanked by executives in sharp suits. The room was packed. Flashes from cameras turned the room into a flickering strobe light. This wasn't the usual wrestling media. This was real media. Sports journalism, entertainment portals. They smelled blood in the water. They smelled the money. The questions were sharks. Zara, why now? After 4 years? What is the exact nature of your medical clearance? Was your departure political, as has been rumored? Are you targeting the champion, Morgan? She was a master in the ring, but this was a different kind of fight. She watched the executives deflect, giving clean corporate answers about opportunities and timing. They were trying to control the narrative, to package her return as a business decision. But Zara hadn't come back for business. A journalist from a major sports network pushed, "Zara, you left at the absolute peak of your career. Morgan has, in your absence, claimed your throne. Is this personal?" Zara leaned forward, ignoring the executive who subtly tried to motion for her to stand down. She looked directly at the journalist. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the room. "When you build a house, brick by brick, with your own two hands, you never stop owning it. You just let other people visit." She paused. "Playtime is over." The room erupted. The executives smiled. They had their soundbite. But Zara knew the truth. She hadn't answered the question. Not the real one. Not the one about the fear. She was playing the part, the one they all demanded of her. The pressure was mounting. She was back, and now there was no escape. She had to see this through, whether her body was ready or not. The hardest call didn't come from an executive or a journalist. It came at 2 a.m. after the press conference when she was finally alone. The name on the screen just read, "Mom." She answered, and for a moment there was just silence on the other end. Not the awestruck silence of the fans, but the heavy, disappointed silence of a parent. "I saw it on the news," her mother said finally. Her voice wasn't angry. It was tired. "The news, Zara, not from you. You promised me." The promise. The one she made in the hospital when the painkillers weren't working and the doctor was explaining the nerve damage. "Never again," she had cried, holding her mother's hand. "I'm done." "Mom, They broke you," her mother whispered, the old pain surfacing. "We had to watch them build a dynasty on your name, on your sacrifice, while you were learning how to hold a coffee cup again. And you just walked right back to them? For what? For them? For that screaming crowd?" Zara had no answer. How could she explain? How could she say that it wasn't for the crowd or the company or even the championship? How could she explain that sitting on her couch, safe, felt more like a death than the injury ever did? "I have to do this," she said softly. "No," her mother replied, and now the tears were there. "You want to do this. There's a difference. I hope this time, when it breaks you, there's enough left for us to put back together." The line clicked. Zara sat in the dark. The arena's explosion felt a million miles away. The cheers were hollow. The cost of this return was being tallied, and the first payment had just been collected. Her family, the only people who saw her as a person and not a persona, now saw her as a stranger. Morgan was unraveling. The champion had spent 4 years meticulously building her kingdom. She wasn't just the champion. She was the company's centerpiece. She had a faction, the dynasty, who protected her. She had the merchandise sales. She had the confidence of the board. She had erased Zara's memory, replacing it with her own image. Now, in one night, her kingdom had developed a massive crack. She was backstage at a live event, 3 days after the return. She was screaming at a production assistant because her custom title plates were late. It wasn't about the plates. Her faction members watched from the doorway, sharing an uneasy look. They had signed on to back a winner, a confident, untouchable queen. They were now looking at an insecure, paranoid tyrant. "She didn't even touch you, Morgan," one of them finally said, trying to be the voice of reason. "She just walked out. You're letting her win without laying a hand on you." Morgan spun around, her eyes wild. "Win? You don't get it, do you? Did you hear them? They never cheered for me like that. Not once. I have given them 5-star matches. I have done every talk show. I have broken my back for them. And she just walks out. And they forget I even exist." She pointed at the television where a hype package for Zara was playing. That, she seethed, was supposed to be my legacy. The champion felt the shift. The executives were polite but distant. The writers were suddenly non-committal about future plans. The power she had taken for granted was evaporating. Zara hadn't thrown a single punch, but she had already landed the most devastating blow. She had reminded the world, and Morgan herself, that Morgan was just borrowing the crown. The true queen had just come home to collect. The following week, the ring was set for a contract signing. It was the classic setup: a table, 2 chairs, and a swarm of security guards who everyone knew were purely decorative. Morgan came out first, clutching her title, the booze raining down. She looked composed, her mask of arrogance rebuilt, but her eyes kept darting to the entrance ramp. Then the chime, the music, the roar. Zara emerged. She walked with that same deliberate pace. She didn't acknowledge the crowd. She slid into the ring, never taking her eyes off the champion. She sat down, picked up the pen, and signed the contract for their championship match without even reading it. She pushed it across the table. Morgan laughed, a sharp, nervous sound. "Just like that? 4 years gone and you just walk in and sign? You think you can just skip the line?" Zara finally looked up, her expression unreadable. "There is no line. There is only me, and the person keeping my property warm." Morgan stood, flipping the table. The security guards flinched. "Property? This is my era. I built this. You fled. You were weak. You were broken. And you ran away because you knew you couldn't hang with me." Zara stood slowly. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "You're right." The statement hung in the air. Morgan, the crowd, even the announcers were stunned into silence. "I was broken," Zara continued, her voice microphoned, intimate and terrifying. "An injury did what no opponent could. It took my body. But you let the idea of me take your soul. You've been wrestling my ghost for 4 years, and you've lost every single night. You're terrified, because you know I didn't come back for this." She tapped the championship belt. "I came back. For you." The match was set. The world was watching. But the script everyone expected was not the one being written. Weeks later, the night of the pay-per-view, the climax. After a brutal 20-minute war, both women were down. Zara's shoulder was failing. Morgan was exhausted. Morgan had been the dominant, aggressive champion. But Zara was something else. She was a survivor. Morgan crawled to the corner, pulling herself up. She looked at Zara, who was struggling to rise, favoring her injured side. The crowd was screaming for Zara to finish it, to complete the fairy tale. Morgan saw the opening, the injured shoulder. This was it. She charged. But Zara didn't try to defend. Instead, she collapsed. She just stopped. Morgan stopped, confused. Zara looked up from the mat, not in pain but with a strange, haunting clarity. And in that moment, the twist was revealed. The arena, the fans, and Morgan all thought this comeback was about the championship, that Zara had returned to reclaim her spot at the top. But they were wrong. The injury that took her out 4 years ago wasn't just physical. It was a mental shatter. The pressure of being the icon, the undefeated, the legend, had broken her will. She had begun to believe she was invincible, and the moment she wasn't, her entire identity crumbled. She didn't leave because of the pain in her shoulder. She left because of the terror in her mind. This comeback wasn't about winning a title. It was a test. It was about facing the exact moment of her failure. As Morgan stood over her, bewildered, Zara slowly, painfully, got back to her feet. She looked Morgan in the eyes. And she smiled. Morgan, realizing the truth, stepped back. This wasn't a fight. This was an exorcism. Zara didn't win the match. She didn't need to. She lost the match, but she conquered the injury. She conquered the fear. The moment she walked back into that arena wasn't about changing SmackDown. It was about changing herself. The crowd exploded.